So thanks for being here, and at the end of my little talk, maybe you'll understand why Mount Rushmore is here. Sound good? Alright, think back a long, long time ago, okay, before South Dakota is famous for Mount Rushmore, when this is just a regular old mountain, and think about what might have been going on out here in the hills, okay? People who were out here in the Black Hills at the time, what they were doing was either one of two things. They were either in the agriculture, which is like farming, things like that, or they were mining for metals, like tin and gold, okay? But the economy in South Dakota, even before the Great Depression, was kind of bad during this time, okay? They were struggling. Even before the Depression started, things were kind of rough here. So a group of people were getting together, and they're kind of thinking amongst themselves, how do we get people to come to all places on the beaten trail to South Dakota? And when people come and they visit a location, they end up paying money to eat and sleep and stay. So they're really trying to think of ways to save the economy here. And a man named Don Robinson, okay, he's a state historian for South Dakota. His portrait is actually the one on the far left, up on the mantle up there. He's a state historian, and he comes up with the idea, let's use the natural resources that we have in the Black Hills, all this granite, all these spires and everything, and let's do a colossal carving that'll draw people to South Dakota. They'll come here, they'll want to see it, and in the process they'll stay and spend a little money, spend a little time here and everything. So naturally, who they think of is Gutzon Borglum. His portrait is right there in black and white on the wall. And he's down near Atlanta, Georgia at the time. He's carving the side of Stone Mountain. Okay? He's putting giant granite figures on the face of this mountain. And he's really the only artist in America who's doing something like this at the time. So he's naturally who they think of. And they ask him to come out here, view the area, and will you do this carving for us? Well, Don Robinson, when he first got this idea in his head, he was thinking Western figures, a Western memorial. He wants to put Wild Bill Hickok, Chief Red Cloud, Lewis and Clark, and he wants to carve them all in a different location. Has everybody heard of Needles Highway? It's a highway. It's about 20 miles from here, and there's just these huge granite spire formations out on this highway. Okay? And that's where he wants to put these faces. So Gutzon Borglum gets out here, and he says, yes, I love this idea. This is going to be awesome. Two problems. I don't like anything you just told me, and I don't want to do it where you told me to do it at. Okay? So he gets here, and he changes the project completely. First of all, he changes the location. He changes it from Needles Highway to Mount Rushmore. He likes this mountain because there's plenty of rock to work with. It's a big blank canvas. He just sees all that carvable rock and knows he can do a massive carving in there. And he also likes it because it faces the sun. All day long, the sun shines on the face of Mount Rushmore, okay, from morning till afternoon. The second most important change that he makes is the theme. He takes it from being a Western sculpture to a national sculpture. He's starting to think that this needs to be something where everybody in America will want to come see this. And it'll mean something to everyone in America. It doesn't matter where you live, this is all our national monument. So that's the change that he makes. And he has full creative control over the project once he gets here. And these are the 4 people that he chose to put on this mountain. Everybody asks, why these 4 presidents? It's all because of Gutzon Borglum. This is who he chose. Does anybody know why he chose these 4 people? Anybody want to take a quick guess? Well, probably in his mind, yes, that's why he chose them. What he wanted to do was create a symbol from left to right. He wanted to represent the birth, expansion, development, and preservation of the first 150 years of the United States. A lot of people ask now, why can't Reagan go up there? Why can't Kennedy? The reason is because they don't fit into that first 150 years that he wanted to memorialize. Why do you think Washington represents the birth of the United States?
He was the first president.
Exactly. So who's more fitting than George Washington to represent the birth? Jefferson. Why do you think he represents the expansion? Exactly, good job. Yes, everybody thinks, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, that's what he's most known for, but he was also president when we received the Louisiana Purchase, and that doubled the size of the United States at the time. So he represents the expansion of America. This one's a little bit harder. He's the most controversial president to be up there, especially at the time he was being carved. Why do you think Theodore Roosevelt would represent the development of America? Any guesses? All right, I'll tell you. He did a lot to develop our nation into the superpower that it is. He did a lot for workers' rights. He's the reason that kids your age don't have to work in coal mines for pennies an hour. He did a lot for workers' rights. He passed the Safe Drug and Food Act. It's the reason that people can't sell us dangerous foods. They get in trouble, if they put bad things in their products. He gave us our national park system. He's the reason that all our special places in America, people didn't just buy them up and build factories and houses on them. He's the reason that these areas are preserved for future generations to enjoy. And also, he was president when we built the Panama Canal, which really brought us into the 21st century and made us a global superpower. And then a little bit easier, Lincoln. Why do you think he represents the preservation? Emancipation Proclamation? That's a very good guess. Yes, he did write that, and he was very much admired for that. But preservation more goes towards him being president during the Civil War, which is closely related to what you said. Being president at that time, he kept the nation together. If things had gone differently, we would have been split into two different nations, which would have been a pretty dramatic change from what we have now. We're all still together, we're all one union, and that's largely thanks to Abraham Lincoln. So that's what he wanted to symbolize with Mount Rushmore. That's the meaning behind it. As the artist, though, his main job was simply to make what you see behind him. This is a plaster model. When I'm done giving my presentation, you can look around the back corner and you can see it's got a wood armature. He's literally stuffing pine straw and sticks into this thing just to kind of keep it together. And he changed this 9 times. This is the 9th version of Mount Rushmore. He was constantly cutting up this model, rearranging the heads, putting them in different spaces, trying different things. But this is the final form that Mount Rushmore took. And this was his job as the artist, to make what you see behind him. You can actually see in some spots his handprints and his fingers where they were going through the wet plaster. But what would happen is he would take everything off this model and convert it from a 1:12 ratio. What that means is that every foot on this model is 12 feet on the mountain. Does that make sense? And the way he would do that was with a tool very similar to this. He would use what's called the pointing system, and this is a very ancient practice from sculptors all over the world. You can see a large one on Abraham Lincoln's head up here. But just to get an idea of how it works, this would rest on top of one of the president's head, and it would get measurements from left to right, up and down, and back and forth. So he's getting the depth, the height, the angles, and he's using what's called triangulation to put all these measurements together to convert everything you see on a 1:12 ratio. So that's how they converted this to the mountain. These guys who were working on the mountain were largely relying on math. Sometimes he would send up a giant plaster face like you see over there, just an actual one, just so the workers would have a reference. But when you're up on that mountain and you're next to the face, all you really see is a rock wall. So they're relying totally on math. So Gutzon Borglum is down there taking the measurements, working on this plaster model, but 400 men were responsible for going up there every day and removing the 500,000 tons of granite that you see piled up below the sculpture. These guys were working hard, very, very hard every day, and the way they would do that was with dynamite. Most of the work here was done with dynamite. 90% of that material was removed with explosives. Remember how I said earlier that a lot of these people were out here mining for minerals in the Black Hills? Well, a lot of them easily converted from that to working on Mount Rushmore, and they were very talented using explosives. But just to give a simple illustration, to remove a lot of rock, they use a lot of dynamite. And to remove a little rock, they use a little bit of dynamite. And so they would get within 4 inches of the final surface using only explosives. They were actually so skilled with this that they would have wooden scaffolding to stand on that was right in front of the faces. And they would do blasting between that wooden scaffolding and not damage it. So these guys were really good at what they were doing. But the next step, once they were only 4 inches away from the final surface, was called honeycombing. They would drill a hole every couple inches into the rock, and it would make the surface of the stone look like this. So you can easily see why it's called honeycombing, right? And the way that they would drill these holes is by carrying one of these. They all use air-powered tools, and they hang from these Bosun chairs. Now these chairs are actually so that you can fall asleep in one of those and not fall off the mountain. But can you imagine working all day long and you're holding one of these? Now you're on the side of the mountain, so you're not using gravity to work like this. You're working like this at 4 or 5 hour shifts. Does anybody want to validate that this is actually very, very good? You? Yeah, come on. Now, can you imagine hanging from that seat? Hold that. Yeah. Everybody can come try this before we're done with the presentation. Yeah, I'll have it up, and when I'm done talking, I'll check it out. So that's what they use to drill these holes. So you can imagine Washington's face, and it all looks like this. That was called the honeycombing process. The drill bit would actually go down, touch the face of the president, the final surface, and then what they would do is take just wedges and hammers. Here's an example of a hammer. And since the surface of the rock is now weak, they could just knock away the spaces in between. Make sense? So now, you're down to the final surface of the carving, but it's rough. It has this texture. And they didn't want that. They wanted it to actually look like skin. So the last part was using this device. It was called a bumper. Now, what you can think of when you see this tool, it's just a really fancy way of sandpapering a large surface. Okay, from this point, they would take this tool, they would put the bit in right here. The bit would bounce around, and you see the little teeth on it? They would just work the surface for hours and hours until it was as flat as a cement sidewalk. So that's how they got that smooth texture, was this. This bit never actually attaches to the device, so they would just cup it with their hands, and these were constantly falling out. So you can imagine up there in the rock pile, there's just hundreds of these hidden up there, like little Easter eggs. So that's all the steps it took to carve Mount Rushmore. That was it. It took 14 years, 400 guys, and no fatal accidents. If you think about that this was being carved during the Great Depression, and alongside other projects like the Hoover Dam where hundreds of people lost their lives, this was an amazing feat to not only have a job during the Great Depression, but to have a safe one where your friends aren't being killed every week at work. So that's a really proud accomplishment here. So, when the carving was done, it stood as one of the largest sculptures in the world for quite some time. But if you look at our model, and you look at the mountain, you'll notice that a few things are different. What do you see different? Say it again? Yep, the suit. What else? Yeah, the blue. Yeah, and if you look, both Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, they all had hands, right? Well, this is actually what the mountain was supposed to look like. There's 3 major reasons why that never happens. The first is the type of material they found in the mountain as they were carving. You have to think that this was the 30s. They didn't have modern technology to know what was going to be below the surface. So they ran into things like mica schist and all kinds of fault lines that made some of this impossible. When you're back up on the Granite Terrace, it's kind of hard to see from here, but look right below Washington's chest, and you'll see a dark line of rock that's all mica. And it's crumbly, it's weak, so you can't carve it like you can carve the granite. Because of fault lines, they actually carved Thomas Jefferson's face twice. They started on the opposite side of Washington's head. They got, the eyebrows, the nose, all that started to come to form. And they realized that a fault line in the rock would probably cause the nose to fall off in a few hundred years. And Gutzon Borglum, being the serious artist that he was, he had no intention of making something that was only going to last a few hundred years. So they blasted it off the mountain and started over where it is now. So somewhere up in that rubble is Thomas Jefferson's nose, his face, his eyes, all that stuff. They actually thought with Theodore Roosevelt that they were going to put a hole into the mountain. Everybody always wonders why he's so far back into the sculpture. That's because they had to just keep carving and carving and carving away to reach solid enough granite to put the face in. And at one point they actually thought it wasn't going to happen and they were just going to have a hole there. They got it done, but he's the thinnest face up on the mountain. It's only about 40 feet thick. And so that's the first major reason why it was never completed, the way you see behind me. The second biggest reason is what was starting to happen around 1940. Well, no. What did I say? War? Yeah, World War II was starting. Even though we were not involved in the conflict as Americans at the time, Hitler's army was already coming across Europe and we knew it was a time of conflict. And so funding was diverted from this to make bullets, war machines, things like that in preparation for going into World War II. And it was actually a very wise decision because 2 months after this was declared a finished work of art, Pearl Harbor was attacked, which is our naval base in Hawaii, and that's when we entered the war. The third, and probably the most important reason it was never completed, is in 1941, on his way to Washington, D.C. to petition for more funding for this project, the artist Gutzon Borglum dies. He passes away en route to Washington, D.C. And from that point, his son Lincoln Borglum takes over the project and uses the remainder of the money to just take down the equipment, the scaffolding, put on some final textures, and just call it finished. He didn't want anybody else to take credit for this except for his father. So those are the three major reasons that it looks the way it does today. So we have about 20-30% of what was initially envisioned, but it's a pretty good 20-30%. And the last thing I want to kind of touch on is what this can mean for you, besides being a national monument. The mountain is made out of granite, and that's going to erode 1 inch every 10,000 years. Gutzon Borglum was aware of this, so in some spaces he added 3 extra inches, adding 30,000 years to the lifespan of Mount Rushmore before it even starts to have a negative effect. So this will potentially be here for over 100,000 years and beyond. And what he was really thinking of was something like Stonehenge. Has everybody heard of Stonehenge? Do they know what that is? You do? Yeah. It's a really old monolithic sculpture in Britain, or in the UK. And it's so old that people don't remember why it was made, they don't remember who made it, and that could potentially happen here. This could be here thousands and thousands of years from now until people don't even remember who these men are, who built this, why this is here. So what Gutzon Borglum did was design a hall of records. There's actually a 70-foot hallway in the back behind Lincoln's head. And it was never finished in Gutzon Borglum's lifetime, but what he wanted to do was to create a museum of sorts, so when people come here in the future, they'll know exactly what Mount Rushmore is for. It was never finished, but in the 90s, his daughter, who was still alive at the time, got together with the Park Service, that's us, and we put a titanium case up in the Hall of Records, loaded it with porcelain tiles to explain what Mount Rushmore is, who built it, along with important documents to us, like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, biographies on Borglum, and who's president is. So those materials, the porcelain and the titanium, will never corrode, and that will be here as a reminder to future generations, your kids' kids, and so on, what this is and why it's here. So I want you to leave with that not only is this a national monument, but it's going to be a symbol of you guys, this era in time, the past 100 years. It'll be a symbol of us that will go so far into the future that we can't even imagine it right now. So that's what this is here for.
Be careful of the jacket.